Bet the Board presents Stay Green. Stay Green is your first stop for all the metrics, matchups, and money-making opportunities at the track each race week. This is Stay Green, the NASCAR betting podcast. Here are your hosts, Todd Fuhrman and racing analyst Chris Werme.
Welcome in to the Stay Green podcast, part of the Bet the Board podcast network. It's all about NASCAR all the time as we return from a 2-week Olympic break. Drivers rested, crew chiefs, at least for the most part, more about that in a moment, largely rested and recovered, and hopefully handicappers as well. I'm your host, Todd Fuhrman, joined as always by my esteemed colleague and co-host on this very fine program, professional NASCAR bettor Chris Werme. And Wormser, hopefully you enjoyed your 2-week respite. You polished off about 15 books on that bookshelf behind you, and you are refreshed and recharged for the stretch that is the final 4 weeks of the NASCAR regular season, and of course the grind that is the 10-week playoff push.
Yeah, was able to accomplish a few things. Went down to Vegas, hung out with you, went to dinner, came back up here, did read a couple books. Got a sinus infection. And then I also did something. I painted my first and last ceiling. So
you actually painted a ceiling. That's a little bit more aggressive than just painting a wall. Can you briefly walk us through what that experience was like before we get into the Cookout 400 this weekend in Richmond?
I've made it quite clear to my lovely wife that I'm not much of a helper or a handyman. So what she's done is waited.
I could have told her that long before you guys got engaged, let alone married.
Yeah, I know. Well, I was very honest up front. And so what she's done, this is very clever. She has waited till she's damn near 30 weeks pregnant to perform all of these tasks. And I can't just sit there and watch. Like, I have to. Like, this morning, she's like sanding the walls. And she's like, I'm not supposed to do it while I'm pregnant. She's got this mask on. I'm like, oh, for heaven's sakes, just you go outside and relax. I will do this sanding. Anyway, so well done by her. You know,
manual sanding or power sanding?
No, manual sanding of,
all right.
You know, I don't know.
I figured you were going to try and plug a former NASCAR sponsor here. You're going to say, yep, I use my DeWalt sander to try and be able to get things done. But at least you can't lose fingers when you do it manually. I'm not that worried about, your soft, delicate hands being roughed up. And if you have a callus or two, that's fine. Our NASCAR specific audience will appreciate that. But for those folks who may be tuning in to Stay Green for the first time because they've stumbled on Bet the Board for all of our college football or NFL previews, we break things up around here and we try and recreate a NASCAR race. Stage 1 this week will be all about the Richmond race this weekend. Some unique variations on tires, strategy for the Cookout 400. Stage 2 this week, we'll look at a title odds reset in terms of if there is value and who we think is worth at least a look in the long shot market there. And stage 3 with some news breaking earlier this week from Jordan Bianchi, speculation on what the 2025 playoff schedule can look like. And Chris will tell you more or less why he hates it and thinks it could create unbettable situations in terms of big picture future odds. So as we get into stage 1, Worm, we go to Richmond for the second time this season for the Cookout 400, but NASCAR has decided to mix things up. We know it's a high tire wear track, 3/4 of a mile, flat track, but it hasn't yielded or lent itself to all that much in the way of exciting racing. So what does NASCAR do? They reintroduce the option tire that we saw at the non-points paying race at North Wilkesboro for the All-Star situation. Drivers will be given a 45-minute practice session to at least identify how long this softer tire compound may last, when they could potentially use it. And when we talk about track specs, before we get into the track comps, do you look at the spring race at Richmond being a different handicap than what you see in the summer and fall based on track conditions, weather, or anything along those lines?
I would say it's going to be fairly similar. They're both going to be night races. At least that's what the weather kind of predicts, that we'll be able to get the race in on Sunday night. I do think it'll be very similar conditions. Now, I do think that if you take a look at the start of the race, Obviously, we started on the wet weather tires. I don't think that we'll be starting on the option tire. So I think you have to kind of take the first, I would say, 60 laps or so of the spring race with a grain of salt, maybe kind of fast forward past that, and then look at, maybe from halfway through or the end of stage one through the end of the race as a direct comp. But that will be the closest comp that I would use. You could maybe throw in some Loudon there, but I do think with the time of day going to be very similar. I think we'll see similar track temperatures this week as we did earlier in the year.
The Cup Series has been racing in Richmond, Virginia since 1953. All signs point to us only going there once in subsequent seasons. The talk around NASCAR has been that the second Richmond date, or I guess the first Richmond date, could be swapped out for an international race, whether that takes us to Montreal or Mexico. More on that down the road when NASCAR puts the finishing touches on their 2025 schedule. When we talk about racing in the state of Virginia, Richmond, Martinsville, it doesn't matter. It all starts with a man that calls Chesterfield, Virginia, his home. That, of course, being Denny Hamlin. And as we look at some of the Tier 1 drivers, we have seen some interesting odds movement depending on the books. So we'll call Denny Hamlin and Christopher Bell more or less co-favorites, although Hamlin has drifted out to the third favorite at a prominent national book. More on that in a few moments. But I want to start with Denny Worm. And when we look at the 11 car, 165 laps led over his last 5 races, but just one top 10 finish over his last 7 races. So the All-Star break comes at the perfect time for him to try and hit the reset button. 3 wins so far this season for him, 5 top 3s, 8 top 5s, 9 top 10s. When we talk about Richmond and his next-gen history, just 1 finish outside the top 4 in 5 races here. Average speed has been outstanding. Starting position has been great. Running position. I mean, everything that you want to say points to the 11 being very much in the thick of things when it comes to racing Sunday night.
Absolutely. I think we've seen consistent speed out of Denny, but inconsistent finishes. You can kind of chalk it up to unlucky late race variance, which it absolutely has been, but that's something that every driver has dealt with this year. So this is nothing new. And if you take a look at the spring race, I do think that the 11 was maybe a top 5 or 6 car. But the reason he was able to pull off the win, obviously the late race caution with 2 to go,
much to the chagrin of his teammate,
jumping the restart. So a lot of the late race variance that's hurt him helped him earlier in the season to win this race. But where I think Denny really sets himself apart, and this will kind of segue also into Chris Bell, is these guys, these teams, both the teams and the crew chiefs especially, are willing to let their drivers stay out for 5, 6, 7 more laps and kind of hang on in hopes to pit and then pick up speed towards the back end of a run. And that's what we saw Denny Hamlin. I think he came out 9th on this last cycle before the final caution and was able to drive all the way up to 3rd, where he struggled with Joey Logano. That's when the tires started to level off. But that's the only way that Denny was able to work his way through the field, is because he does have the ability to, save his tires towards the latter half of a run and give his team an opportunity to do something different to make passes. Because what we've seen with this tire, especially with this car, is everyone kind of falls off at the same rate, and we don't see a lot of passes for the lead. Most of the passing that happens is just a tweak to strategy. And that's what we've seen out of Denny Hamlin and also the 20 team and Chris Bell. So I think Denny will be there. I don't know that 7-2 price is worthy of a play, but we start to see him float up to this 5, 6, 7-1 range. If it gets to 7, I think that's an auto bet anywhere for Denny Hamlin, especially a short track. So I don't like the short price at that 7-2, but gosh, as he starts to float, you might have to pull the trigger.
I mean, he is kind of on the drift as we record here late in the day on Wednesday. I mean, there are some 5.5s and 6s out there, so I wouldn't fault anybody for using an outright pick on the 11 to try and start building their race card, given what we've seen from him before, and specifically Toyotas and JGR, how they've performed at these flat tracks. And when we talk about flat tracks, Christopher Bell has kind of been the gold standard for what we've seen. He finished 4th at the Brickyard, ended a streak of 3 straight finishes, 12th or worse. He's led 473 laps over his last 9 races, so starting to come into his own. When we talk about his 3 victories, 12 top 10s, and as far as his next-gen history at Richmond, just 1 finish, worse than 6th in 5 races the last 4 trips here. Bell hasn't started better than 20th, though, so he's found a way to work himself up through the field with a little bit of raw speed. The driver rating has been there, the average running position. And while I said off the top, most of the NASCAR community should come back well rested, one man who won't be in Richmond is his crew chief, Adam Stevens, who had surgery not just on one knee, but both knees. Details remain a little bit sketchy in terms of what he was doing with his family. So you hope Adam Stevens can recover, but the 20 team won't be intact when they come to Richmond this weekend.
I just was texting with Alan Cabana before we hopped on here, and both knees, huh? And apparently it was a really stiff diving board that he jumped on. And
we all get old. We all get old. I mean, as we approach these ages, you have to be a little bit more careful. So if he was trying to recreate some of those Olympic caliber dives that we've seen over the last 2 weeks, you can understand the challenges.
Both patellar tendons, I guess, popped.
I'm not jumping on a diving board. That's if I
that's
was
it. I'm
anyways.
done.
No trampolines, no diving boards, none of that crap at this point in my life.
Yeah, I think that the team, obviously, he will be very active in the race strategy from his house, or whether that's from, not at the track, but I can't imagine he'll just be sitting back watching the race. I'm pretty sure that he'll be monitoring and be in direct communications with that 20 team throughout the weekend, not just on race day. So, he opened 7 at some places 2 weeks ago. That's been beat down to 5.
I think that was a little bit aggressive for one book that decided to put out odds well in advance. I was actually surprised. I didn't even anticipate odds coming out that quickly.
Yeah, and I think that 7, if you jumped on 7 or some of the 6.5 that was available earlier this week, if you're able to get enough down, then that's well done. We kind of base everything off of, I know Superbook is kind of I don't want to say the gold standard, but between them and Circa, that's a great place for us to start, as their limits are slightly better than some of the other places that we're making bets. So to see him open 3.5, I thought that was a little short for a guy that hasn't qualified that well here. Yeah. This is, a potential for a live bet at that current price. Yeah, he's going to be great. Clearly the 20 team has been the best within this short track package, whether it was, whether it's Phoenix or Loudon. I think that they've been the best, and Chris Bell's an elite driver. I anticipate him to be good, but I do think that the week's going to have to come to him a little bit, because I don't anticipate him qualifying quite as well as, we saw it, a place like Gateway, where he was able to stay out front and lead a bunch of laps. We haven't seen that out of Chris Bell at this particular track. So I think it's one of those things where late in the race, you'll see that 20 team up there, but 3.5 is pretty short for me. and so is 5, but the 6.5 and 7s that were out there, if you're able to pick those off, I think those are good numbers.
When we talk about Toyotas, one other driver that we have to mention, of course, would be Martin Truex. His price very similar to his teammates, but he hasn't exactly been the model of consistency. 3 finishes at 24th or worse over his last 4 races. His last top 5 came 11 races ago at Kansas, a number that kind of blew me away when you consider how short the 19 has been priced more often than not. Still searching for his first win of the season. His best chance, as you mentioned at the top of the show, did come here at Richmond. Unfortunate sequence of those yellows. As far as how he's performed at Richmond in the past, the last 15 races here, he's had a driver rating of 100 or better in 13 of them. Led a season high 228 laps at the spring Richmond race. Average finish here in the last 5 races during the Next Gen era, 6.6. No finish better than 4th, but also no finish worse than 11th. So when we begin to look at the 19, look, this is a guy that I'm not necessarily running to fade myself, Chris, but I can't back him at such short prices until I see him go out there, put together some consistency, and actually get himself in the mix to win races late.
That, and I think you couple, what you said along with, he didn't go out and really pass anyone for the lead. Now, yes, he did late in the race. Kyle Larson did cycle out in front of him, and Marty was able to get back around him and dispose of Larson rather quickly. That was the only point he really flexed his muscles. Other than that, it was just some timely cautions and some mistake-free driving out of Truex that kind of found himself in the lead. I tweeted earlier this week that I thought that the best car we've seen all year was Chris Bell at Phoenix, and there were some other.
You'd be wrong, by the way. That was SVG at Chicago, even if it was for only 9 laps.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, it's kind of tough. You're just fast for 9 laps. But I'm not going to argue with you there.
You didn't tell me how many laps he had to be the fastest car. You didn't say he had to cross the finish line on the lead lap either. So,
all right, listen, I'm not here to argue. This is a subjective take here. However, even though Truex went out and led over 220 laps, not one person suggested that Truex in this race was a dominant race car. And I think that's more a product of just the track. And I don't think you can discount him necessarily, because he did go out there, and you have to be flawless on pit road with this car. You have to still go out there and perform on restarts and get through lap traffic. But it's not like he went up there and took the race away early in the race. He was just kind of around all day. So I do think this is a little bit of a short price. That 5-6 to 1. If you want to compare it to, I think, gosh, he was 4.5, 5 to 1 at Loudon. I think that's a car that warrants that type of price at Loudon. He was that good.
Yeah.
I don't think he was that good at Richmond. If anything, like I would agree with you, slightly overvalued. I just don't. I don't know. I think I probably could have given you 5 cars if they got to the lead at Richmond, that they weren't going to be passed. And Truex just happened to be one of those guys. You could throw Hamlin in there. You probably could have thrown Logano in there, Larson, Bell, all of those guys. If they got to the lead, it was just so hard to pass that any one of them could have won the race or led that many laps. So that's why I'm not quick to say that he's overvalued at this point in the weekend. And we'll see what happens when they unload. And remember, with this option tire, it'll be interesting to see how how teams set up their car for that option tire, because I imagine they're going to save these option tires for late in the race, at least one for the last stop. How long do they hold on for? When do the cautions come? So I know that we have some pretty strong opinions at this point in the week, but we still need to keep in the back of our minds that we do have a huge wild card this week in these option tires, that they did use it with North Wilkesboro, but there's no fall off there. So Richmond
it was a full
repave
at North Wilkesboro. So it was a hell of a lot different than a track that we're going to see this weekend at Richmond that typically treats tires like it's a cheese grater. So We'll see who can manage tires. And we talk about tire management. 2 other drivers that are in tier 1 in the single digits. Joey Logano actually opened as high as 12. He's been bet down. When we look at Logano starting to round into shape, 3 top 6 finishes over his last 6 races, goes into the break off a 34th place at the Brickyard. But when we talk about how he's performed at Richmond, specifically during the next gen era, an average finish of 7.2. Second in the spring here was his actual best finish over the last 5 races. 4 finishes, 7th or better in 5 trips. And then, of course, there's Kyle Larson, who hasn't exactly led a ton of laps over his last 5 races. Most importantly for us, he did lead the money lap at the Brickyard to get us where we needed to go. Larson, 4 wins this year, 7 top 3s, 9 top 5s, 11 top 10s. And since 2023 at shorter flat tracks, if we back out Iowa, has an average finish better than 7th and consistently finishes inside the top 5. As far as Richmond is concerned, finished 3rd here in the spring and won this race last spring as well. Started from the pole in 2 out of the 4 races that we've had in the next gen era. And the last 3 trips here, he's led 237 laps. So a little bit unusual for a track where Kyle Larson is figuring it out. And you see him priced in that 7.5, 8 to 1 range alongside Joey Logano.
You tell me who should be a favorite in this matchup, Joey Logano or Kyle Larson. I just don't see a world where you can price Logano the same as Kyle Larson. So
it's a fair way to look at it.
It's even though they're both the same number, Logano at 8 makes me kind of want to puke, and Larson I feel like is very bettable at 8 to 1. If you look at just how the weekends unfold in the Cup Series, it seems almost every week is Larson unloads better than expected, and Logano's just kind of around. Now, I'm not taking anything away from Joey Logano in this 22 team. I'm comparing him to a very dominant race car, but a lot needs to go right for Logano to go out there and win this race. He had a great run here in the spring. Absolutely. This is a good track for him, but it's not a place where he didn't drive through the field. He just had a solid day all day long, and he's really hard to pass. So, I think Logano will have a solid run. He, probably will run anywhere from 8th to 12th, and maybe with some strategy, get out front. He might be able to hold off some faster cars, but Kyle Larson can go out here and look fast in practice and go out there and put it on the pole. And that first pit stall here is very important. And let's remember that I don't think that there was a caution that came out when Larson had just pitted. He decided he was going to 1-stop stage 2. Everyone else was going to 2-stop it. And it came back to bite him. And he was still able to battle back and to finish in third. So I think Kyle Larson 8-1 is a good price. And I think I'm selling Logano at 8-1. Now 12, I understand why people played that number.
Right.
I'm still going to need to see a lot more out of Joey Logano before I start playing him at single digit odds.
When we start to move from tier 1 into tier 2, depending on the shops, these drivers priced anywhere from, let's call it 13 to 1-ish, upwards of 16 or 17. And it's a very predominant Chevy group, Chevy and Ford, I should say. When we're talking about Chase Elliott, 16-ish, William Byron there, Brad K, Chris Buescher from the Ford camp, specifically RFK. Chase Elliott, look, average finish this season, 10.5. It's the best in the series, but he has been the model of consistency, even if he hasn't had race-winning cars all that often. A pair of top fives, his best finishes during the next-gen era when we talk about Richmond history. When we look at William Byron, people wanted to talk about him slumping during the summer months, but he's got 3 top 8 finishes over his last 6 races, significantly better than Denny Hamlin. Just hasn't been in the discussion late to try and win some of these races. But in 5 next-gen trips to Richmond, 3 of those races have resulted in him finishing outside the top 10. Did finish 7th in the spring. When we look at Brad K, knowing tire management always plays a role with an option tire, the savvy veteran should very much factor into this, but just 1 finish better than 10th over his last 7 races. Finished 8th here in the spring, back-to-back top 10 finishes, though, at Richmond, and his average finish at 10.4 at 5 next-gen races at Richmond has been consistent. No finish worse than 13th, but no finish better than 6th. And Chris Buescher drove his car into victory lane. And if we want to look at the fall summer race potentially being different than the spring, well, maybe Chris Buescher is that guy. Podium finishes in both fall races, 3rd in 2022, 1st in 2023. But keep in mind, when we're talking about Chris Buescher, he went off at 60-1 in this race last year. A little bit different of a value proposition right now at 16.
Yeah, and what we were doing there was we were just picking off a number when we had Buescher there at that price. It was he just shouldn't be 60-1. It wasn't that we thought he was going to win the race. It was just, hey, RFK shouldn't be priced like that. I want to go back to Chase Elliott. I don't hate this price based on his recent speed. It seems that he is now kind of the second fastest Hendrick car. He's surpassed William Byron as kind of just having the most speed week in and week out. Not race winning speed. So I don't know that you can go out there and play this 16-1 price and you might steal a little bit of value, but I don't know that he can win the race quite yet. Where I do think that there is some value on Chase Elliott will be potentially in head-to-head matchups. He's been very consistent, and that's what you're looking for when it comes to matchups. Speed is one thing, but ultimately you want a guy that can just cross the finish line, on the lead lap. There's a lot of times we're crossing off matchups or we're circling matchups before the white flag comes out. So I do think that if you're looking to get some action on Elliott, who I do think is undervalued, I would look more to matchups than I would his win or his top 3 price. When it comes to William Byron, 3rd or 4th best Hendrick car all of a sudden. He might have a little bit more speed than the 48, at least when it comes to qualifying, but consistency hasn't been there. And boy, could you imagine after Coda or even Martinsville seeing William Byron at 16-1? He had 3 wins early in the season, kind of thought he was going to open up the favorite at a lot of tracks moving forward, and he's fallen quite far. So 16-1, gosh, I'm not going to blame anyone if they think that that's a good price, but we still haven't seen much out of him at Richmond. And gosh, just a loss of consistency. I think that they're just trying to limp into the playoffs and hopefully they can find something there. Otherwise, I think it's going to be hard for them to make the Final Four with this inconsistency. When it comes to RFK, gosh, I think you hit the nail on the head when you were talking about just hadn't qualified well. You mentioned Brad had 3 straight race starts of 13th or worse. That doesn't bode well for winning races. Qualifying has become more important in this sport than I've ever seen it. And RFK just tends to miss week in and week out when it comes to qualifying. When that happens, you're usually better off to wait till after practice and qualifying to get a number. Do they both race better than where they qualify? Mostly, yes. And if not, they are good enough drivers that their crew chief will put them in position to, restart in the top 2 rows late in the race, or at some point take the lead, like we've seen with Brad Keselowski last week or 2 weeks ago at Indy. They didn't get the cautions they needed in order to make it on fuel, but he at least had a chance there at the end. So both of these drivers I trust, but the way that their weekends kind of transition from unloading average to maybe getting the car slightly better to qualifying below average, I think you can wait and get a better price, even if they look decent in practice. And also, if Brad goes out and does look good in practice and qualifies well, it's still Brad Keselowski. You can bet him at 8-1. This is a guy that if he looks good in practice, he's just not all of a sudden going to disappear in the race. So it can happen if you start deep in the field, but it doesn't happen if you qualify well and look good in practice. Brad's just not going to disappear. So I'd go ahead and wait on both of those guys, mainly because of their qualifying, for lack of a better term, their qualifying issues, because that's what they are.
Yeah, they've really struggled to find one-lap speed, but we'd be remiss as well when we talk about RFK if we didn't give a shout-out to our favorite member of the RFK family, Brian Murphy. Congrats on the birth of his baby boy, Bo Knight Murphy. If you're out there listening, though, everyone in the NASCAR community knows you're supposed to save those arrivals for the offseason, much like the Werme family is trying to do.
Yes.
So shout out to you in those impending sleepless nights. Hopefully made a little bit softer by grabbing a checkered flag in victory lane as we inch closer to the playoffs, especially for the 17. When we're talking tier 3 drivers, Worm, Ty Gibbs, maybe now finally being priced the right way. I feel like every week he gets bet down just blindly for a little bit of that FOMO that you see largely in golf, that people just want to be holding a ticket on the 54 when he puts it all together, but it just hasn't been there. I mean, one finish better than 11th in his last 8 races. This is a guy that does have 4 top 3s to his credit and 5 top 5s, but, still looking to try and find his way into victory lane and be relevant late in the race. 2 drivers that we've dabbled on in the outright market as well. Good prices still available on them. Ryan Blaney and Tyler Reddick, both in that 20-1 range. We look at Blaney. Richmond hasn't exactly been his favorite track, but this is a driver who's figuring things out, especially on these short flat tracks, showing speed week in, week out. And a driver in Tyler Reddick that we've talked about that I don't think is getting enough buzz for how good and consistent he has been.
Yeah.
Yes, he just has 1 race win this season, but 5 top 3s, second best in the Cup Series. 9 top 5s, has him tied for first in terms of leaders, and 15 top 10s. You just pencil this guy in to being relevant late in a race. You drive around the top 5 more often than not, the bounces are going to start to fall your way. And as Denny Hamlin will be the first to tell you, you start to win races if you're finishing inside the top 5. So when we look at those 3 drivers, I think that's a good place to start with tier 3 before we get into some of the longer shots on the board, the Josh Berrys, Ross Chastains, and the Bubba Wallaces of the world.
Yeah, Ty. Yeah, I don't see how you price Ty Gibbs shorter than Ryan Blaney or Tyler Reddick. You just look at the last few weeks of these drivers. I don't care track history. NASCAR is a very momentum-driven sport, and clearly the momentum is with the 12 and the 45 and not with Ty Gibbs. Not to say that that's all Ty Gibbs' fault or it's all the 54, but or the 54 team for that matter. It's just you got to have things start going your way. And I would even argue that things have gone against the 45 team and they still are getting good results. So, even though, his last 9 races, his worst finish is 22nd, but after that, it's 8th of the last 9 races. So he's been really impressive, and he probably could have won 1, 2, maybe 3 races if he doesn't make some boneheaded mistakes. So
for sure.
I do think with both the prices, now we've taken a price on Blaney at 25-1. I still think 20 is a great price. I know that his track history isn't good here, but
that's also why he's 25-1. If his track history was good here, Blaney is 10-1 or 12-1.
Exactly. And his track history was terrible at Homestead last year, and he was the best car there. So I know that there's a lot of people that are, shorting Blaney or whatever, but at an 8-1 price where some shops have him priced, I would hate that. But, when you can get a guy that's arguably top 3 in speed week in and week out at 25-1, I'm going to go ahead and nibble there, especially when I think his price is going to close maybe in the 10 or 12-1 range. Now, I'm not as high on Tyler Reddick as I am Ryan Blaney. We went slightly larger on Blaney than we did Reddick, but Reddick's just been around, and he had a chance to win this race last year, kind of threw it away in very Tyler Reddick fashion. Someone called him the mini bed shitter. Larson's the original. and then you have Tyler Reddick.
Larson's the OG.
The OG, yeah. Larson's the OG bed shitter, where he just loves to give races away in weird ways.
It's that damn dirt background. You can't trust either of them.
And then Reddick is the mini bed shitter. But the reason we don't like Kyle Larson in those scenarios is we're taking him at like 4.5 or 5-1. So I'll take mini bed shitter at 25-1 any day of the week over a 4.5-1 Kyle Larson OG bed shitter. So I like both the 45 and the 20 or the 12. I don't know that they can go out there and win the race, but I think both of those numbers will shorten up by the time we go green on Sunday.
That's fair, and it makes a ton of sense. And if we look at 3 drivers who would love a win to basically secure passage into the postseason, talked about Josh Berry, 30-1. Current form, 4 straight finishes, 20th or worse. But when we're talking about Richmond, this is no doubt a track that the 4-car has circled, given what we see on short, flat tracks, especially those where you have to manage tires. Ross Chastain still searching for a top 3 finish, his first of the season, just 2 top 5s on that resume. Came home 15th this past spring. And then, of course, there's Bubba Wallace, who quietly put together some consistent runs going into the break, 4 straight finishes, 13th or better. Average finish over the last 5 races better than what his season-long numbers are. And when we talk about the 23 car, 61 total laps led this season, 26 of them came at the Brickyard alone. When we look at that trio of drivers, anybody worth a small nibble in the outright market?
I don't know about the outright market. I think if I had to pick someone that I think could win this race, I'd probably have to say Josh Berry, only because he was able to drive through the field rather easily earlier this year. I think he started, 28th or 29th, maybe even higher than that, and found himself in second place at one point in the race. I don't think Ross Chastain or Bubba Wallace is capable of that. On the same token, I don't know if the 4 has enough speed to go out there and win the race. I do think that if Bubba Wallace somehow gets to the lead, he could run away. I don't think the same thing about Josh Berry. So a little bit of give and take there. I do like Josh Berry and trust him a little bit more in the matchup market than I do the outright market. I think that this 30-1 price, gosh, if it was maybe 40, it'd be worth a play, over 40-1, but 30 is getting a little bit short for a guy that hasn't qualified well here in the past. So going to pass on the outright market, but there might be some plays come race day where you're betting on him in some matchups. Ross Chastain, I don't even know what to say about his last few weeks. I mean, Nashville 33rd, a place where he won last year, Chicago 22nd, Pocono 36, Brickyard 15th. These are atrocious, and he's in a playoff battle.
Yeah,
there's just nothing that seems positive that's going on right now in that one camp. I'd say the 99's been as competitive or even more so competitive recently.
99 taking things overseas to win races and build that confidence back in NASCAR.
Yeah,
Brazil.
Exactly. So I got Yuck and Yucker next to Ross Chastain. I just don't see other than his price, there's nothing good about this one car. And the price is probably directly correlated with those finishes and the speed. It's not like he's just been up there running up front and has had bad luck like we've seen Denny Hamlin. He has been stealing track position, and those are the only time he's ever run in the top 5, as if he just stays out on strategy somehow. So I think that there's all hands on deck in that one camp. Bubba Wallace, I would say complete opposite. Bubba has thrown together some solid finishes. I think he should be really happy with the way that these last 4 races have gone. I know that he had a rough one in New Hampshire, but to come back with 2 top 10s in the last 4 races and a 13th at Chicago Street Course, I think they got to be happier than hell for that. And a 10th at Pocono. So Bubba's also finding out he's been able to make up a lot of ground just by running solid races. And when you start to see just consistency pay off, it kind of lends to being more consistent. Like, hey, we don't have to go out there and race guys really hard for second or third if we can just stay in the top 5 all day long. So I think Bubba's learned a little bit. And I think that the more points he kind of scores, just getting stage points, he's been qualifying well, staying up front, keeping the mistakes to a minimum, not getting too frustrated. And this has been a great track for him. He ran solidly in the top 10, earlier this year. And he was even caught kind of with his pants down with Larson with a bad caution, and both of those guys were able to recover nicely. So it wasn't a fluke that he was up there. He was able to work his way back. So I like Bubba this weekend. I don't think he can win the race, but there might be some other options where you can get money and good on that 23 car.
All right, well, we'll try and figure out, which potential avenues may exist for some of these drivers. But before we do that, we'll wave the green-white checkered flag and put a bow on stage one. I'll encourage all of you, our loyal Stay Green listeners, to follow Chris on social media at ChrisWerme15. I'm Todd Fuhrman. You can follow me there. Most importantly, as always, for all things Bet the Board, be sure to follow the podcast at Bet the Board Pod. All of your college football previews, conference by conference there. Divisional previews currently in progress. We inch closer to week 0. With the college football schedule, and the NFL regular season will be here before we know it. Going into stage 2, I don't think we have to spend a ton of time on this, or quite frankly, stage 3, but I do think it's worth a little bit of a discussion as we hit the reset button after a 2-week Olympic break, and we talk title odds. We mentioned Ross Chastain's struggles. I mean, he's on the bubble. I can't imagine he's going to get himself into the thick of things from a conversation. When we talk long shots, I'm not sure there's anybody that you have to run to try and bet here in this particular market, even given the level of unpredictability we may see with 2 road courses, a little bit of nonsense scheduled for the postseason. And when we look at the odds, to go out there and win the championship, I mean, Kyle Larson, Denny Hamlin, Christopher Bell, more or less priced the same in that 9-2 range. Talking about William Byron, whose number has drifted out amid some of his summer struggles at 6-1. Then, of course, there's Ryan Blaney showing a ton of speed that I'm sure none of the final 4 drivers would like to see the 12 in the mix, given what he would look like should he unload at Phoenix with a chance to win back-to-back championships at 8-1. Chase Elliott, 10-1. Reddick, Logano, Martin Truex Jr. at 14-1. Then you're talking Brad Kay, Chris Buescher, and Alex Bowman, all prices of 20-1 or greater. When we talk title odds, I know we've said this until we're blue in the face about how the schedule may not set up and offer all that much in the way of upside or betting value. When you look at the current numbers right now and what we're seeing from these drivers, anything stand out to you in terms of drivers that you're intrigued by versus drivers that you wouldn't touch with a 10-foot pole?
I wouldn't touch the favorites with a 10-foot pole, not with the way that the schedule's playing out. I mean, you got Atlanta, Watkins, Glen, and Bristol as your round of 16. I don't know if you saw what happened at Bristol earlier this year, but it looks like at the tire test, the same thing happened again. So that does bode well for guys that are really good at managing tire wear. I do think that these crew chiefs will set up the cars for them to last a little bit longer, but still that's going to be lurking in the back of people's minds when there's going to be a cut after that Bristol race. Watkins Glen, I think that, the players that have been good there will continue to be good there, but Atlanta, you're throwing another restrictor plate or, I call them a plate race, super speedway race in the playoffs. That's just, anyone can win that. And if you find someone like, let's just say Suarez goes back to back, that's a spot that, most people didn't think was going to be taken up by a guy like Suarez. You consider Suarez and Cindric kind of the first guys out. And then you go to Kansas, Talladega, and the Roval. No, thanks. I don't want any part of that. Kansas. Yeah. You have to circle Kansas as, I would say, the most important race of the playoffs this year, just because Las Vegas, Homestead, Martinsville, you're going to find that the cream's going to rise to the top. You're going to get some consistency with those races. But man, no thank you on the round of 16 and round of 12. It's why I have not made a future bet this year. If I were, I would say Martin Truex Jr. and Tyler Reddick. Truex has clearly shown speed on short tracks, which obviously we're going to be at a short track here at Phoenix for the championship. And he's also a very talented road course racer. You could say the same thing about Tyler Reddick. We're going to see 2 road courses in the playoffs. Both of those guys are more than capable of winning on either one of those road courses. So I would say at that 14-1 price, they've had enough speed in the race car. Tyler Reddick's had the consistency. Truex has had the speed. I think that's where I'd be focusing if I were looking at playoff numbers right now. It's hard for me to get excited about Chris Bell at plus 350, Denny Hamlin at 4-1, and Kyle Larson at 4-1, especially when you could see those numbers as they enter Las Vegas, Homestead, and Martinsville. So that's where I'm looking to make my bets, is probably after the Charlotte Roval. Once the dust settles, let's see who these final 8 are and probably make our picks from there.
If history is any indication, we'll be able to get Christopher Bell at 40 or 50 to 1 going into Martinsville. Into Martinsville. Although I don't think the number will quite be that long given what speed we've seen, but you may as well just be able to back him in the outright market, given that the 20 car seems to put his best races together in those high leverage spots that do present themselves given the unique format that is the NASCAR playoffs. I know you had to mention Watkins Glen because you're really excited about the return of Juan Pablo Montoya back to the NASCAR Cup Series as well. So
yeah,
I'd like circle him as a road course ringer. What'd you say?
Yeah, I'd like to see his ass wreck half the field.
There's a possibility. Yeah. You know, that's what he is known for. He won't hesitate for a second. The only unfortunate part is he won't be in a Chip Ganassi Racing with a giant Target logo right on his hood. So it changes the dynamic a little bit. So a short stage 2 green-white checkered flag. And while we're talking about playoffs, we may as well discuss playoffs and the way things lay out for what's roughly been proposed for 2025. And we see an article from Jordan Bianchi that circulated earlier this week in The Athletic. Encourage all NASCAR fans to go ahead and check that out, albeit behind the paywall. And some changes. No Homestead in the playoffs, much to our chagrin, one of our favorite tracks to bet. Would love nothing more than to see the championship return there, given how it tests drivers, how predictable it is from a handicapping standpoint, and the changing track conditions, especially with high tire wear. But when you look at how things are proposed, at least right now, Darlington expected to be the first race in the playoffs. Gateway, the second race. Bristol becomes an elimination race in the middle of September. You go from the 16 drivers down to 12 in the second round. New Hampshire, Kansas, and Charlotte. That'll pair the field from 12 down to 8. And that's where things start to get a little interesting in the round of 8 with Las Vegas, being a race with a lot more importance attached to it now. From there, we head to Alabama and Talladega Superspeedway, where anything that can happen often does before Martinsville becomes the cutoff race. And then, of course, we'll go back to Phoenix in early November to crown a champion yet again. Just wanted to get your initial thoughts on what the proposed playoff format would do to your handicapping. And you talked about the unpredictable nature and how we don't have a lot of future exposure. And when I say not a lot, I mean 0 going into the 2024 postseason. Would that potentially be different going into 2025 with those 10 playoff races?
Yeah, I think they've made positive changes from a predictability standpoint. Anytime throwing in Talladega into that round of 8 that has me circling Las Vegas. If you're a crew chief, you're circling Las Vegas right now as the most important race outside of Phoenix for next year, 2025. Just kind of a quick rundown. I like Darlington, Gateway, Bristol. That's fine. I think that having Bristol be an elimination race will be certainly entertaining. New Hampshire, Kansas, in the Roval. You said Charlotte. Let's make sure that they know it's the Roval.
That's a good point. I appreciate you correcting me. I saw Charlotte. I got excited when I initially saw this and then went, wait a second. We're going back to the Roval. It almost feels like we're in Mallrats in that scene. The kid's back on the escalator. Let's sort this out and let cooler heads prevail.
I would love to be in that meeting where it's like, I don't know. I think people really like the Roval. It's like, what do you mean? Like the Coke 600 was a great race and it was shortened. Like, I don't know how with this car and in this package, which has struggled so much on road courses to pass, do they want just I think, do they like the fact that there's stage points and you can get a weird, someone trying to stay out and get stage points? I don't know.
Here's my take from it. And of course, we're not privy to these high level discussions. It's not like NASCAR goes, hey, look, we have the schedule in place. Let's reach out to the Stay Green boys and see what Chris and Todd think we should be doing. My feeling is that NASCAR wants Charlotte in some capacity to be in the playoffs. So by keeping the Roval in the mix, they're allowed to have that road course that they want for one of the disciplines that's there, and we can go back to Charlotte. Yeah. Because if we race on the more traditional layout there at 1.5 miles, then we have to figure out, okay, which race comes out and where we can put the road course in. Maybe Watkins Glen goes out there and it's the best racing we've seen, and in 2026 we go back to Watkins Glen. But I think they want to make sure that we're including a road course in the playoffs, and so this allows them to kill 2 birds with 1 stone. We're in Charlotte. It's the road course, and we may be stuck with this particular track layout in our playoff format for the indefinite future.
Yeah, I also think that the business side of it, you have to be right about that. I would say that's probably the best explanation as to why they do that. And I don't know who owns Watkins Glen, and I don't know that information like a lot of other people with SMI or NASCAR owns the track, but I do know that NASCAR owns Charlotte. So and they want to keep a road course in there, especially when it looks like SVG is probably going to be cup racing. I think that it's just a great story to have him go out there and at least have a chance to move on in the playoffs with a win. So I do like the idea that there's a road course. I wish it wasn't the Roval. I do think Watkins Glen would be a much better option, but like I said, I don't get that phone call. Hey, Worm, what were you thinking we should do? So I'll just kind of stay in my lane and just try to predict races. But, Las Vegas, that Vegas race, you are going to see the biggest celebration, whoever wins that Las Vegas race, if it's one of the final 8, because that gives them, not only does it give them two more weeks to prepare for Phoenix, they can rest easy at Talladega, and it's going to make Martinsville potentially a must win for multiple drivers. I know that's always the case, but it could also be, the points leader, if they have a decent day at Las Vegas and the 2 of the points leaders have issues early in the race, we could see the 2 potential favorites having to win at Martinsville. And that kind of gives you 2 championship races. So we'll see how it plays out. It could be very boring. We could just see no one of importance win that Dega race, or we could just see tame racing, I guess. But I do think ultimately it will be better from a handicapping standpoint for the season-long futures. I do not think that Atlanta, Watkins Glen, Bristol this year, and then Kansas, Talladega, Roval, those first 2 rounds are just pretty much off limits for me. But like I said, if I was interested, I would say Truex and Reddick would be the 2 that I'd be looking at.
So one interesting thing, because the luxury of having the internet at my fingertips, when you go on some of these rants, NASCAR actually does own Watkins Glen.
Okay.
According to this lovely search engine called Google,
Never
they
heard
bought
of it.
Watkins Glen in May of 2019 for the robust price of $2 billion, which I know you have sitting in your couch cushion.
What?
There. Look, who knows what
they bought
other
Watkins Glen for $2 billion?
That's what it says. It says NASCAR to buy International Speedway, owner of Watkins Glen. Now, maybe there we go. Hold on a second. They bought International Speedway, that entire company, for $2 billion.
Okay,
so it wasn't just
I was like, what? I got to make a track. I'll put
this
it for
is
sale.
what happens when your reading comprehension is complete dog shit. And Charlotte, I believe, is also SMI.
Okay.
So maybe.
No, Charlotte's NASCAR.
I thought Charlotte's SMI. Why don't you pull up on your Google machine right now?
Unbelievable. I'm pretty sure Charlotte, because
all right,
yeah, that's why.
Go ahead, take a look. I know Canadian internet's a little bit different, so I'll encourage all those folks out there, because this makes great podcast kind of content, to follow Chris on social media at Chris Werme 15. I'm Todd Fuhrman. You can follow me there.
SMI.
And this is our de facto checkered flag on our first episode back from the 2-week hiatus. So Google, you did not let us down. You proved that Chris Werme was incorrect. So I'm sure under some level,
I don't know.
They have a deal with SMI that SMI probably has to have a playoff race in Charlotte. So I think that's probably from a political standpoint. But, for all the people that are better connected to NASCAR that have perspective on this, by all means, jump into the comments, call us idiots, share your perspective on things, because we would love to have someone shed some light. But with all of that rambling aside, as we approach this portion of the program, I think you kind of tipped your hand a little bit earlier when we broke down individual drivers. But as far as best bets are concerned, we've been on a little bit of a run in this department, both on race day best bets and everything else. Somehow the race day best bet we gave out at the Brickyard didn't lead a single lap other than the final. Nothing like coming home in 22nd and the driver that you fade comes home 23rd. But better to be lucky than good when you have good market entry. What have you seen in terms of building our racing card for our Stay Green listeners at a number that's now widely available, since we probably can't offer that much in the way of head-to-head matchups at Superbook like we were doing, knowing that they've been removed from a variety of jurisdictions?
Yeah, we're going to stick with Bubba Wallace. I do think that consistency is key for this team right now. I think that they're seeing it work, and I anticipate more teams to kind of struggle on that cut line. So I think that they kind of have the most speed, and they're going to stay consistent. I like Bubba Wallace top 10. The best price is going to be at DraftKings. That's plus 130. Pretty widely available at plus 120 as well. I like it at that price. Anything even money or better, I think that Bubba Wallace is going to finish in the top 10. I anticipate him to qualify inside the top 10 and kind of hang out there all day. If he can stay out of trouble, I think that this is the best play on the board at this point. And hopefully we'll learn a little bit after practice because, man, I do want to touch on this option tire. There's kind of 2 points where you need to understand the option tire. One is the crossover point. When is the prime tire going to be better? How many laps into a run? And then, kind of the passing point. So how long will it take once the tires have crossed over on speed, where the harder tires, going to be faster or hang on to pace longer? How long is it going to take them to run down the leaders? And this is where a lot of math is going to come into play. So make sure you're paying attention to that. Especially if you're live betting. We don't know that information yet. Based on what we saw at North Wilkesboro, there's not a lot of fall off on the option tire, but that's North Wilkesboro. There's definitely going to be more fall off here at Richmond. Is it 20 laps the crossover? Is it 30 laps? Is it 15 laps? And then when can a driver actually make up that ground and make the pass? Because you're going to want to figure that into the calculus when you're doing your live betting. So I do like that NASCAR is willing to give something like this a shot in a points-paying race. These drivers have skin in the game, and it will be very interesting to see what happens in practice, because I think you'll see everyone go out on the prime tire and try to make their adjustments, and then they'll go out there and they better give this option tire a long run, because we've seen it before at this track where we get long runs, and gosh, there's so many different ways you could use this option tire. If there's a 120 lap run to the finish, you could, can you go 40 laps on the prime tire, get out to a lead, and then throw on the option tire, throw on the option tire first, run 30 laps, get out to a lead, and then throw on the prime tire and then try to hold everyone off. I don't know. Maybe that's the way. It's going to be fastest, but it will be certainly interesting. I don't want to just glaze over the fact that we're throwing in a new tire to the sport, which is just crazy to me, and then a limited number of them. So throwing the fact that there is a potential for some rain, we could see 3 tires in a race. What is this, Formula One all of a sudden? You could have the rain tire. You could have
normally I'm one to take shots at F1, but the product is significantly better, and it's been a lot more competitive over the last 5 to 6 weeks headed into their summer breaks. So I actually found myself watching F1 races again instead of the Max Verstappen victory coronation each and every Sunday morning overseas.
Best case scenario is this option tire becomes the main tire at this track. I think that I'd love to see, drivers, both hands on the wheel trying to get this thing to last 50 laps. Now, I don't want cording or anything like that. I just want fall off and handling. Carl Edwards used to love that about the car that we had in like 2017, 2018. And if we could kind of achieve that again, this could be the saving grace for passing when it comes to this race car. So keep your fingers crossed that there's a lot of fall off and not a lot of cording, because I think that if that's the case, we could see this option tire become the prime tire at a place like, maybe even Martinsville and Phoenix, where we haven't seen a ton of passing in the past.
And everyone who wants your up-to-the-minute thoughts after watching the extended practice session on what the option tire can provide can tune into the pre-race poll. At what time on Sunday afternoon?
It will be 4:30 Eastern, 1:30 Pacific.
Very well done, kind sir. So, again, follow Chris on Twitter at ChrisWerme15. I'm Todd Fuhrman. You can follow me there. Most importantly, for all things Bet the Board, follow the podcast at Bet the Board Pod. All right, my friend, no more rest for the weary from here on out. We'll be with you for the quick monkey math on this, 14 straight weeks until we crown a champion in early November in your old stomping grounds in Phoenix. Let's hope that the racing is the best we've seen with the option tire. Credit to NASCAR for at least going outside the box to try and improve on a track that's really lost some of its luster in recent trips here. So to all of you guys and girls, appreciate you guys tuning in to the Stay Green podcast. Remember, rate, review, subscribe, share the podcast with your friends, family, colleagues, people you like, people you don't like, anybody and everyone. Spread the NASCAR gospel, and hopefully we can turn some of these betting markets into something that's a hell of a lot more liquid going forward. Before Chris Werme, I'm Todd Fuhrman. Best of luck with all of your investments this weekend, and most importantly, with a Bubba Wallace top 10 ticket in hand, hopefully we'll see you at the window.